Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. And on this episode of Sonar Fishing, let's talk about points, because points are an important structure all year round. No matter what type of reservoir you're on, points are definitely going to be a key player as far as structure goes. So, you know, if you don't know a whole lot about points, you're probably going to be listening to a lot of guys talk about, primary points, main lake points, secondary points, and saying things like that. And so I wanted to kind of break down what they're talking about and what they actually mean when they say primary, main lake, or secondary point, or whatever you're hearing. So essentially what I consider a primary point, I also call them, main lake points, but that can kind of get a little bit deceiving, which we'll kind of get into that, is you see right here on this expertly drawn, lake or section of a lake, we've got the main lake right here, okay? And then you've got this creek that's coming off of it, and so you've got a lot of different points within the main lake and the creek as well. So on the main lake, as you can see here, we've got this main lake shoreline, which is the black, line denoting just the edges of the lake itself. And then you've got these points right here, right on the main lake. So right as you enter that creek. So those are what I consider primary points or main lake points, okay? So those are right on the main river channel, main lake, and sometimes also on the main creek channel. So for instance, like these, you've got this big creek here, and you've got these points that are right off of that main creek, okay? Because you've got these offshoot little creeks and pockets, okay? But you've got these points that are right off of that main creek channel. So those can also be considered main lake points or primary points, but they're within this large creek, okay? Now, if it's a small creek, like I wouldn't consider this, a point within this to be a primary point or a main lake point. I would consider that something like a secondary point. So like this one right here, that would be well, we'll circle it instead. That's a main lake point, main lake point, main lake point, main lake point. And then once you get off of the main river channel or the main creek channel, then you start getting into secondary points. So points like this back here, or this one right here, or even this small one right there. Those are considered secondary points. Those are what I consider secondary points. A lot of other anglers may have a different, set of definitions for all these different types of structure. But in general, that's what people are talking about when they're talking about main lake or secondary points. So how does this apply to fishing, especially in the different seasons? So I'm gonna talk about like right now. So like the pre-spawn period, this is a really good time if you're fishing a reservoir to focus on secondary points and some main lake points too. So most of the time, this time of year, pre-spawn, unless you're fishing for spots or smallmouth, I'm going to be focusing on either the creek, main lake, so the main creek points, those primary points within a creek where, those fish have quick access to spawning habitats, spawning areas, or I'm fishing the secondary points in the backs of these creeks. So looking at this right here, and I also forgot to point this point out too. So what I'm looking for this time of year, like pre-spawn time period, is I'm going to be looking for these big spawning pockets, okay? So a spawning pocket, spawning creek, whatever you want to call it. And then I look for the points close to that, at the mouth of those different creeks and pockets. Most of them have a defined point. Some of them are a little less defined of a point. They're more rounded or squared off. They're still considered points, and those are where the fish are going to kind of hang on to that structure and then, ambush prey as it comes around those corners. And so I'll either be focusing right here, like if it's kind of early pre-spawn period, it's definitely not near spawning time. The water temperatures are still pretty low in the 50s and that sort of thing. I'll focus on these primary points outside of main spawning pockets on creeks, okay? And then as it starts to warm up, I'm going to be following these fish back into these creeks, into these secondary points, those back points. And when it gets really close to spawning, like you're right around that upper 50-degree range, you know, 58, 59, and getting close to the 60s, that's when I'm gonna be fishing those secondary points that are closest to those spawning pockets where those fish are gonna push back into the spawn. So those are the type of areas that I like to focus on leading into the spawn. Now, don't forget these banks too. Okay, so these banks, a lot of these transition banks between the primary and secondary points, those are generally, you know, a little bit steeper, sometimes like 45-degree banks, things like that. Look for transition rock, you know, rocks that are, you know, it's transitioning from like gravel to bigger chunk rock. Those type of situations are gonna be killer, where you can throw like a crankbait, you know, like a DT6 or something like that on those type of banks. So as they move from these primary points to the secondary points, you know, definitely utilize these banks. You know, don't pass up those banks in favor of just going to the point sometimes, because you can catch a lot of fish in between. And also, if you look at this, we've also got a little tiny point that's kind of hidden. This is where navionics maps, or, you know, good mapping in general, is going to allow you to find those sweet spots that aren't apparent by just looking at the shoreline. So make sure you have good maps, and obviously I'm putting up some screenshots of the navionics app on my iPad on here as we talk. But just pay attention to your mapping, because you might be able to find those little key sweet spots that aren't as obvious looking at the shoreline. But in general, that's kind of the breakdown of primary, main lake, and secondary points. They're a really important type of structure this time of year, and to me, they're one of my favorite types of structure to fish. You know, I love going to a reservoir that doesn't have a lot of grass, it has a lot of rock structure, and throwing like a football jig or something like that and just slow rolling it off of that point. That's like one of my favorite patterns in pre-spawn. And then also throwing a crankbait on these transition banks. So anyways, guys, that is kind of a breakdown of the points that I like to focus on this time of year during the pre-spawn. So if you guys have any questions, drop a comment below, and make sure you check out the Navionics boating app and also the Navionics cards that you can put in your units. They're really gonna help you in search of finding the best structure on any lake. So thank you guys for watching. Make sure you like, share, subscribe. I'll see you out on the water.